Okay, we are here today to interview Dr. Amy Tsui, who is Professor of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. We want to get to Bloomberg's his name recognition.
All the names are important.
Dr. Tsui is President of the Population Association of America last year in 2017. Right. Thank you very much for being here with the PAA History Committee today.
Not at all.
And what we'd like to do is to kind of work through your entrance into demography, how you got to this point, how you see the field having evolved over time, and some specific things about the Population Association of America in its role in the whole field of population. So maybe you could just kind of take us back to as you were starting college, and because I know you started college at Carleton College in Minnesota, which isn't necessarily the usual choice. So tell us how things transpired over time.
I was born to a father who lost his country because of the 1949 China Communist Revolution. And so he ended up traveling overseas, working for FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and that took him to many places. So I think we developed the bug for international exposure that way. But I ended up at Carleton because he took a year sabbatical at the University of Minnesota, and it was pretty cold, having come from Bangkok at that time. But then after Carleton, you have to remember that that was 1966, 68. 68 was when the U.S. civil turbulence was pretty high. I was a social activist. I didn't do so well in my grades. My father called me home. Home at that point was in Honolulu, Hawaii, which I did not object to. And then I ended up, demonstrating a bit out of Honolulu, but then against the war, but ended up finishing college at the University of Hawaii, and then stayed there because they started the East-West Center at that time. And it turned out that my father being in Honolulu was because he was also affiliated with the East-West Center. So from there, the East-West Population Institute began. They brought in brand new faculty, a new director, Paul Demain was the director, Lee J. Cho, Jay Palmore, James Fawcett, a number of luminaries, Bob Rutherford. They were the new faculty, so I learned my population from them, my population methods. And I was actually in the Master's of Sociology degree at the time, but got this grant to be an East-West Center grantee in my second year. And then they shipped me off to Korea, which was where family planning and fertility issues were emerging, so I spent 6 months.
By that you mean the East-West Center?
The East-West Center, yes, as part of an internship, sent me off there. And that was the beginning, so. From there on, I was hooked on the population issues. I later on gravitated more towards health rather than staying in sort of traditional sociology. Although demography, the reason I ended up in Chicago was again because of Lee J. Cho and James Palmore, and they had been mentored by Donald Bogue. So I ended up where they were mentored at the University of Chicago, and then stayed and worked there. And then from there, I went to University of North Carolina, eventually became director of the Carolina Population Center, and then I went to Johns Hopkins.
But now in your early years there at East-West Center, Paul Demain became subsequently a PAA president.
Yes.
And of course, then you went off to Chicago, where Donald Bogue also was that. My recollection of the things that you published back then with Donald Bogue, they were more in terms of the population growth, more global picture.
Yes. So the 60s, early 70s is also when the population growth issues were coming to fore. Paul Ehrlich had written Population Bomb earlier, and fertility was seen as the driver of population growth. So many people, including many who now have turned to other areas, were looking at the issues related to fertility trends. So I ended up in Chicago working as a doctoral student working in Donald Bogue's Community and Family Studies Center. It was an interesting time. Phil Hauser was head of the Population Research Center then. Donald Bogue and Phil Hauser didn't always see eye to eye. Donald Bogue was also quite cavalier with his hypotheses and beliefs, and he would do his research that would generally support his hypotheses. And so one of them was about zero population growth, and it got published in the Public Interest, and it was how we would achieve zero population growth, I think, by 2000. Paul Domain didn't like that. He was at that point at the Population Council. He was editor of the Population Development Review, and I remember that period because the PAA was involved at that time also, where I was like the young graduate student with the senior mentor and doing some of the analyses that Donald Bogue would interpret, and then we would get into trouble. But, oh, I'm sorry. You wouldn't want me in a courtroom.
You would get into trouble. Okay, now, so did you see that exchange with Paul Domain as getting into trouble or as publicity?
Well, Donald Bogue didn't do it for publicity reasons. He firmly believed that, and the thesis of it all was that family planning programs would have a role with bringing down fertility, which would then end up enabling slower population growth. And that's, I don't know about the program part, but certainly contraception, its availability, organized delivery of it, that piece has been proven to be the good reason for fertility reduction and why population growth has slowed in many places. So what did we get into trouble for? Well, because no one believed that there were organized family planning programs. No one thought that the use of contraception was that wide that it would impact fertility rates in all places of the world, especially in the low-income countries. And at that time, the focus was on Asia and Latin America. Africa was like, no one would want to go there. And they didn't until later in the 80s. So in any event, it was an eye-opening moment to see how academics could debate and strongly and have great opinions. And I think I dove for cover for a while.
Okay. Now thinking about your training and education, one of the things that we're kind of interested in over time in terms of the celebrity issues is where the funding came from and whether you think there was any influence from funders on the things that were being studied and conclusions that might be drawn.
So for sure, various sources of federal funding to build the population research community are immensely important. I mean, we can't underestimate how important that's been. I think the population, the demographic science, behavioral sciences branch at NICHD, I think its early name, but it was started through NICHD by people who really wanted to build the community. And I myself was an NICHD trainee as well at the University of Chicago. Foundations were partners in all of this, and the U.S. Agency for International Development was a big partner because they had started in, I think, 1974, around then, which was about the time I was in graduate school at Chicago. So their funding was for foreign assistance, going to different countries, but again, to amplify the number of contraceptive methods that are available, to improve human resources to be able to deliver them, to understand what the best practices would be, and also to monitor and evaluate, which was the research piece that spoke to those of us who were in academia working on population issues at the time. And you know, we who were trained in the demographic community with methods then always understood, you know, that the drivers were fertility, mortality, and migration, and that we needed to understand the basic demographic methods that were important at the level of populations, fertility rates, migration rates, you know, infant and child adult mortality rates, and how they play together. So, and that those could be used for population projections. So you could immediately see if you worked with projection methods how each one of those three main factors could influence. And then the other piece that became important as far as donors is all the different funders had different goals, right? And ICHD was to build generation and now generations of rigorous population researchers who could do independent research and merit NIH research awards, which is like the gold standard. Other funders were more interested in trying to meet short-term goals, to be able to shed a light on why fertility would change, wouldn't change, why people might want to use contraception, how do you best monitor this. The Demographic and Health Surveys was born out of all of this. So first as the World Fertility Survey, and USAID played a major role in that. And now if you look around PAA, for those who are doing international work, there are a large number, hundreds probably, of presentations based on this bank of DHS data that have been available, allowing for kind of standardized cross-sectional time series analyses. So
this would even include a recent paper that you published with Wynne Brown and
yes,
Population Development
yes,
Review.
yes, that was a lot of fun. Yeah, and I think it enabled us to bring to fore a lot of the things we have been observing in the field, because as I started to work out of Baltimore, I started to travel more. We developed it through the institute there, programs that were in different countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Uganda, Ghana, Egypt and Malawi. And being able to work firsthand with counterparts there was immensely educational. And a lot of what we would read in the published literature would not necessarily align. But then you could see things changing that might not yet make it to the literature. And I think that was what our paper tried to show.
Now, could we step back for just a minute, because you went off to
Sorry.
Hopkins there, but obviously when you went from Chicago to North Carolina, I mean the Carolina Population Center, very, very important. If you look back at the history of the PAA, the early meetings went between Princeton and Chapel Hill.
Yes.
And so as you showed up there, what were the things that you were hoping to accomplish?
So I moved to Chapel Hill as a displaced spouse. My husband took a position at the university, and the director at the time was Dick Udry, and he eventually became one of my other mentors.
Another PA president.
Another PA president. And so he taught me that you can have an eminent, highly regarded population center based on good science. And he himself tried to push the boundaries of science in population and reproduction by introducing measures of the biomarker measures, you know, whether he was going to collect urine or blood or saliva, and to be able to assay these and have markers that correlated with behavior. So I learned a lot about that from him, but I also learned how to manage a center. So he was great because he gave me a home. I did have grants, so eventually I was able to fund myself there. But and then I eventually got an appointment with the Maternal and Child Health Department. That time period actually moved me more towards health.
Okay, so I had never understood quite why you were in maternal and child health, given your background in sociology from Chicago, but it was just resources at the institution.
Yes, and there are, in the range of population centers that NICHD has funded, there are many different kinds of centers. So there are self-standing centers like Michigan, North Carolina. There are centers that are part of departments like the one at Hopkins. There are centers that are somewhere in between, centers that are virtual. But University of North Carolina, the Carolina Population Center had its own space, physical building, which was not part of any department, and it also reported directly to the Vice Chancellor. That was actually a very important lesson as far as intellectual freedom in terms of population research, being able to work in an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary setting where you were not having to wend your way through a department or other departments, other schools to be able to build the collaborations among teams. And so that was one of the big lessons of learning from Dick Udry, and also being at the CPC. Learning from Dick Udry, U-D-R-Y, and being at CPC. So broaden my thinking about population and fertility and contraceptive delivery towards looking at reproductive issues overall, and then also thinking about health from, then I learned about epidemiology. So if you're in a school of public health, population comes to you more in terms of social epidemiology. What we would see now as social demography might be more like social epidemiology. So that was another window to thinking about population issues. And epidemiologists and demographers think very differently.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you got into that too with the move to Hopkins. How did that come about?
So I was I was a Pop Center director then. We usually serve 5 years, renewable. And I was in my 4th year, and I got a call. And I wasn't prepared to move. Mm-hmm. And then the first call came from a chair. The next call came from a dean. So I went to talk to the dean. And the opportunity to work completely internationally was really what sold me on the idea of moving. Mm-hmm. And the CPC is wonderful, but it is in the South. And somehow or other I felt like I couldn't quite convince the North Carolina state legislature or the chancellor or the UNC system that they really should be more global. But I did we competed successfully and got what was first the evaluation project. It was USAID funded, and then the measure evaluation project after that. And those were projects that focused on measurement, monitoring, and evaluation of different kinds of outcomes, contraceptive, fertility, eventually later HIV/AIDS outcomes. And so that was quite international. And it was the largest project, I think, within the school in terms of funding levels. But the thought of trying something new was interesting, so I went to I made the move. I used to, in the early years, call it the Chapel Hill of the North.
Okay.
But it's been 15 years now, I don't say that anymore.
Okay. And the work that you've done over time, it seems to me, has been relatively consistent. Do you feel that way, that your research agenda has been along the same path over your career, or am I missing something?
So I never lost any interest in continuing to work on fertility regulation, whether it was from any lens, you know. During the period when the HIV epidemic became the main celebrity movement and became where a lot of resources were channeled and away from reproductive health or reproduction, we all had to reinvent ourselves. So you'll see that I also did work looking at HIV outcomes and pregnancy outcomes, usually trying to make the case for why contraception is relevant to HIV-infected women, or why it's an important prevention measure. So I never really did move away from thinking about what was the role of contraception in individual lives, in society, and in the world.
So how did you perceive the field of demography shifting as you kind of didn't shift?
Yes. So you can actually find it in about the mid-1990s. I don't know if you knew him, Bud Harkavy from the Ford Foundation. I think one of his last books was Curbing Population Growth. And he asked if I would write a closing piece. So I did. And I talked about how the demographic field, population, had actually divided. And that one side was moving more towards towards family demography, domestic issues. Not that they weren't important, but really as the new generations of researchers were graduating from U.S. universities, most of the interest was really moving towards these newer topics, and that internationally, the people who remained in that field started to gravitate off. And fortunately, USAID always had a fairly healthy amount of funding, right, for research, whether it was operations research or supporting these big, large cross-national survey programs. So there was always enough to keep the international side working, but they did diverge. And you can see it now in the PAA program, where now it's aging, adult mortality and aging, family demography, migration, family size arrangements, and so on. So there is a shift, but that's probably healthy. The one area we somehow never captured, and maybe we need a celebrity for this, so to speak, an advocate, is environment, the linkages between population and environment. And maybe that will come now with more geographers like yourself being involved, but we kind of need that disciplinary contribution in order to really enrich the population field.
I've got one quick question,
Sure,
particularly
please.
about this time period. If you think about Cairo, 1994, and the decade before that, so the real critique that was coming about family planning had to do with a feminist critique that was potentially quite coercive. As the director of Johns Hopkins Population Center, very much engaged with family planning, can you give us your reflections on what that was like to have a time period when your critics were feminist and the issue was coercion?
I still have some of the battle scars on a personal level. We actually were invited by UNFPA, which the UN sponsored the Cairo conference, or the UNFPA did, to write the State of the World Population Report for that year, for ICPD. And I recall them telling us, well, you have to incorporate STDs, you have to incorporate something about mental health, you have to incorporate something about domestic violence. And I was thinking, I only know about contraception. But we got a team, and we did finally pull that report together. But I remember many of us feeling like, is the rug being pulled out from under our area? You know, how much of this is evidence-based? I think the thing I reacted to the most was there was not a lot of evidence about these newer areas that were being introduced. And now I understand their importance. I mean, a woman's health is, or family health is more than just the role of contraception in their lives. But yes, it was quite jarring at the time.
Was there any rebellion by, say, grad students who were more inclined to accept this feminist critique?
Yeah, there
and
was.
The faculty?
Yes, the younger generation were more prepared to embrace it, obviously, than older faculty. And it was fine, because we really did eventually learn from all of them, you know, and I don't think any of us would have been as intellectually enriched if we hadn't. To see the, yeah.
Well, and thinking about the influence of outsiders and funding agencies, how do you perceive the role of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which obviously has an important presence at Johns Hopkins? You were director of that program for several years. How do you see that evolving, and what is its influence on the field of demography?
So the Gates Foundation has had a profound effect on family planning since 2012, which is when they did what was sort of the equivalent of the ICPD, the London Summit on Family Planning. And it's been profound. So they come at a time in the field of demography where many of the scholars are working on aging and other areas, but still there are a few people who are very interested in reproductive health, reproductive rights as well, sexual health, and And the Gates Foundation itself, it wasn't like an immediate epiphany. It was sort of staff, I believe, trying to introduce family planning as a relevant development initiative and investment area to them. And then it happened with Melinda Gates that she did agree, and then they sponsored the 2012 summit. So that part of our field that has always sort of worked on fertility family planning, fortunately now has a champion. And it's been very heartening and also very inspiring. It also comes at a time geographically when most of the attention now is on sub-Saharan Africa and also parts of South Asia. So they have also made those their priority geographies as well. So I think they've had a profound effect. Now they are now the second largest global funder of family planning, short of the US government. So they have exceeded the European donors and other donors. And they continue to message the area of family planning in very positive ways and challenging governments and communities alike to recognize the importance of contraceptive access to women and families. So I think they have had a profound effect. I think they will. And someday somebody will probably do that population projection, with the lines that show this is what the constant rate would have been, and this is what the growth rate is after London 2012.
Mm-hmm. What about, though, the role of abortion? Because certainly around the world, contraception is not the only thing that women
Absolutely.
use. But I noticed in the paper that you published in the special issue of the PDR, you were talking about contraceptive utilization, but I don't think you really mentioned the role of abortion in that.
So I have written about abortion. In fact, we had a journal issue all about managing unintended pregnancies through contraception and abortion. So I don't shy away from it at all. I certainly think it's a personal choice and a right in many societies. The problem with studying it is obviously measuring it. There's so much social stigma around it that it's very hard to get accurate data whether women will self-report ever having it. Even with breakthroughs like the availability of medical abortion, which you can in many places purchase at a pharmacy for $1, the equivalent of $1, women won't report that that's what they have done. So I think until we change the social climate around how people, and it isn't always just an individual woman's decision. It's most of abortions usually happen in low-income settings because they weren't using something before, or because their circumstances are so impoverished that this is the only way out. They can't afford another child. So, and that's also how abortion got legalized in the US as well, how it got public opinion to be on its side in the 70s. So until that social climate changes, I'm not sure that we'll be able to really understand the factors behind abortion use. It wasn't something that under foundation funding that we were comfortable using funds to study, but we had no hesitation to use other people's funds for it.
Okay, that was going to be my follow-up question, whether you thought that funding agencies, whether government or private, tended to keep a lid, really, on the research about the use of abortion.
In principle, they all say, we have nothing against abortion research. But every organization that will undertake it is a bit skittish because of the potential political ramifications, and because they've already had a period of time under the Bush 43 administration where there were ramifications. So.
Right.
But it is so important to study both contraception and abortion.
Right.
If we really are about reducing abortion incidence, we should be ramping up contraceptive access.
Now, can we spend just a couple of minutes here talking about your presidential address from last year, which hasn't yet been published, but which seems, I'm sorry that I missed it, but it seems as though the general theme was that from contraception, a lot of other things in society emanate, which strikes me as being a way of thinking about the whole field of demography.
So population is definitely, it's human capital, right? It's people. Mm-hmm. So everything emanates from people. So you can't avoid the importance of population no matter what. And that's what always keeps us really interested in being part of the PAA or doing demographic research. The talk I did last year was about contraception as a social vaccine. It had two parts. It had one about benefits of using contraception, not because you were necessarily trying to control people's family sizes, but where you had access and you used it for the purpose of trying to time or have the number of children you wanted, it enabled you to have other benefits. You didn't have compressed birth intervals. You didn't end up having mistimed pregnancies when you wanted to invest your resources in something else. So I tried to show how important it was for fetal development, because if you have proper nutrition during the pregnancy period, gestation period, a lot of important organs, in particular brain development, occurred, and that brain development was accelerated through year 3 and beyond, and that was so important to have healthy origins for organ development in the fetus, especially for the brain. So cognitive development was important. And now we're starting to see a lot of research on early childhood development showing that school performance and just cognitive ability is very much tied to fetal health. Then, and that also had consequences, in terms of chronic disease like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases when you were older. So if you had a compromised fetal period of gestation, you might end up having been born low birth weight or premature or having congenital anomalies. So the low birth weight and the prematurity had these long-term implications for you when you were 50 or 60, and you could start to develop metabolic problems. So that was one piece. And then that's in addition to sort of the economic benefits of being able to invest in your children, being able to invest in their schooling and nutrition and so on. The other piece was really how contraception has become like a social vaccine, because over time, as contraceptive methods became more available, that people found them very acceptable and incorporated them into their lives, family lives especially, so that they ended up spreading, diffusing, and that is something I actually learned from Donald Bogue, was the importance of social diffusion. He learned it from Everett Rogers, and it goes on and on, but now we're doing social network analyses. But it is the diffusion of contraceptive practice to where in a population you can have 65, 70% of the female population using it at any given time, and that becomes what Charlie Westoff would call sort of the perfect contracepting society. And so now we have the benefits of that. But the diffusion itself is something, and that diffusion process is something I think we're trying to enable any community that is less disadvantaged and doesn't have access to be able to benefit in the same way.
Now the talk was to the PAA, obviously, but what,
Yes.
who do you see as the audience for the work and that you do and the publications that you put out?
The talk was to the PAA, and I remember asking all the males in the audience not to look to their cell phones, because that is usually the first kind of reaction when people start to talk about birth control or pregnancy and so on. The audience for this was really, I just felt, well, first of all, the one lesson somebody told me was speak to something you know about. Because I was thinking, well, I'll talk about some other topic, change in the global changes and improvements, in the world. But I said, no, I really only know about family planning, so I did. To whom is it addressed? So it really is, to the PAA and to the other, the rest of the field at large that might not come to PAA but might go to the International Society for the Study of Population, is that this is one health intervention, a public health intervention that is as important as seat belts, as fluoridated water, as fortified foods, and it has a role, and it's not just because it's tied to sex, not something that we have to hide or not talk about or study.
Okay. Now, can we turn our attention for a few minutes to the PAA itself? Because obviously, since there are so few departments of demography in the world,
Yes.
the PAA plays a different role than many organizations might. How do you think the PAA has influenced your own career, and then how have you influenced the PAA?
I'm not sure I've influenced the PAA, but the PAA has definitely influenced my career. I started going to my first PAA when it was in St. Louis. I don't even remember if that was 77 or 78. I think I've tried not to miss any. I think I might have missed one when I had our second child, but other than that, I've always attended the PAA. I feel very loyal to it, have occupied different elected offices for it, served on different committees, and now hope that we continue to strengthen it as the professional society for our field. Completely and very much sort of loyal to its mission, which is rigorous science in service to population well-being. So that's been its influence on me, is just that it's been there and it's always provided the public forum for being able to share research. And that's always, that's probably the most important thing that it does. It does obviously publish the journal Demography, and that's an outlet for many of us. And the other thing is its membership, just being able to network with others and learn from others in terms of what they're doing is really interesting.
But now, as PAA president, you've got really kind of a 3-year commitment, president-elect, then president, and past president. In those 3 years for you, which are the 3 most recent years of the organization, what have been the issues that you think have been important to the PAA?
Well, the one that is this year is and has been actually last year and going forward, has been being sure that the U.S. Census is adequately resourced. This year, it has been really more about the introduction of the citizenship question. And this has galvanized a lot of people to think about what it means for the quality of the census. And the implications, obviously, for the census is if it's poor quality, it spills over into counts of population, undercounts of important populations that might be served by federal programs, but also these counts affect, legislative districts, the boundaries of legislative districts, and so on. So it's tremendously important. Right now, that's the one thing. The other thing is really keeping our field resourced in terms of population centers, in terms of demography programs, and as you just mentioned, demography programs don't exist anymore, and we should maybe think of other ways of revitalizing them. Maybe they can't be bricks and mortar type programs anymore, but now we should be thinking about how new communication channels, whether it's doing virtual conferencing, doing virtual education through webinars, in a systematic, organized, credentialed way, if that isn't the way to go. I don't know that we need to always be thinking about a PhD in demography, but we could certainly be thinking about ways to teach people about demographic tools, even if it means doing it in the field. Tombstone demography was one of the first ways that people learned about demographic, learned how to make a life table.
Right. So are those the kinds of things that happen at Hopkins?
Are they the kinds of things?
Right.
No, we are also on the side of losing our population demographic focus, which is in our department, which is really unfortunate, yeah.
And to what is that attributed?
I think we have, so actually I would say that may be unfair in terms of for the whole field, because you can feel the vitality of population here at the PAA in terms of the program, it's coming through the social science. I think sociology is leading in terms of teaching social demography. I think the part that was called formal demography remains the purview of a few people. I think it's much stronger in Europe than it is here in the US. So maybe it's just geographically it's shifting to other parts of the world.
Well, so as you think about Hopkins, another past PAA president from Johns Hopkins is, of course, Andy Cherlin.
Andy Cherlin, yeah.
A family.
Robert Moffat. And,
Well, yes, exactly. So,
Jack Kantner, the other one.
right, good. I was just thinking about the most recent one we interviewed, but you're right. You've got four. So do you see there a coalescing of ideas, or a variety of different ideas about how the field of demography is changing?
So probably what I would say is if I were to evaluate systematic efforts to shore up demography in any university, I would say, sometimes this is really hard unless there's a huge renewal of funding, say, from NIH or NSF. But I think people find their ways. People who have these skills and interests find their ways to either academia or research organizations, and they're able to flourish. So whether they ended up at RAND or they end up at Max Planck or Australian National University of late or Hopkins, usually it's the selectivity of the individual skills that helps you discover how to do these things. So we do have new faculty, both recruited and those who are graduated from our programs, who are now our demography faculty, and they're doing great things. And so was it part of a systematic effort to build the program? To some extent, but what we need to do is to be sure that they can flourish by being sure that they're not going to end up, switching to some other area out of
I've
need.
got one follow-up question to this.
Yeah.
Sort of if you look at the broader environment, particularly domestic environment, in which population centers try to survive and change and what have you, and particularly in the context of your own career, where you've really emphasized the importance of quality demographic research and its ability to produce better policies and programs. And that's the import of your perspective. What happens when the larger environment does not have any respect for what evidence-based research can do in the context of policy formation? So you've mentioned the citizenship question, which was known to those making that decision that it's going to produce undercounts, significant undercounts, and they proceeded to do it anyway. We just had in the last week, we will stop producing evidence-based assessments of abstinence-only sex education in schools, and we're doing it on purpose. We don't care about what you've spent your career doing and what population research centers are all about. What does that do, and does PAA have a role in trying to combat that larger environment in which all this activity is taking place?
Yeah, so this has been discussed a lot here at PAA. I think, so PAA, first and foremost, is never partisan, and they only worry about the impact on scientific research because of whatever changes are going on, political or social, whatever. So the one thing that PAA won't do is do what I did, is dive undercover when soundly criticized or something. So PAA has put forward special sessions to discuss the implications of whether it's administrative record linkage for privacy issues or the census or how global population projections are made. They will always make their conference accessible to people with these sound sort of scientific interests for sharing their research. So I think that it reminds me of how what they tell us when you're a parent and you have an adolescent is your adolescent will always challenge you, but keep talking. And if you just keep communicating on a sound basis eventually.
So you're optimistic.
I don't know that we can be anything but optimistic right now. So yes, I'm optimistic.
Karen, we haven't had a chance to get questions for you, or the things that we haven't talked about. I've kind of dominated the questioning here. So
No, my question was sort of along the lines of Dennis's question, of sort of, you've obviously are a very sound academic, and that's your grounding, but you've also worked very much in the policy space with USAID, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I guess maybe what do you see as the role of academics, and maybe your role sort of bridging that policy, or the research to policy divide?
So I probably am constitutionally, or by my DNA makeup. I remember I used to demonstrate against the Vietnam War. Not probably one to sort of sit and theorize and do the research and just let it be there. So I'm sure that I gravitate towards these areas because I feel it important that good research also get communicated. And there are a number of organizations, including your own, who feel that way too. So I think there's a role for academics, and one thing we can always do better is learn how to communicate things that are kind of obtuse findings in a clearer fashion. So, but there is a role for people to be able to translate. And I see actually this area becoming quite very popular with with the graduate students that I see. And maybe it's because I'm in a school of public health, but they're not very satisfied to sit there and just do the models without the results of the models communicating something that might be important to decision makers. Yeah.
now you've been on a lot of advisory groups and panels over your professional career. Have you gone on those with a specific agenda in mind to
No.
push
No.
a particular part of science, or no?
No, usually, so if there's a scientific advisory board, it's usually because there are questions to be posed to those who are members of the board that we dutifully answer.
Mm-hmm.
If I am a member of a non-governmental organization like a board of directors, it isn't to push anything. It's usually also to advise on their program,
Mm-hmm.
where they go, and to be able to connect their work to parts of the sphere that I work in as well. But I don't think others may feel differently, but I don't think I'm seen as a spokesman
Okay.
for a particular cause.
Okay.
Or at least I think I would be very disappointed if that were the case.
Well, okay. I mean, it's not like demonstrating against the Vietnam War, but in terms of bringing your expertise, that is what you would be doing.
Yes,
Yeah.
but not for a particular message.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. What things have I missed? Because I've been.
How about words of advice for that younger generation of people just entering into the field?
Words of advice for the younger generation. Always explore all opportunities. Don't close your mind off to different ideas. There is no wasted time in anyone's career. When I became, of age and growing up professionally, so to speak, I did have family needs, and so I gave those priority. I don't regret any of that. And I know that young women today are always sort of faced with this challenge, but I think that the world has changed a lot, and I think that there are many opportunities out there. There's just different ways you take advantage of them. And then if research is something that they're very much interested in, they should continue to build their methodological skills. And, I used to always say that our population field could rest and could grow on 3 legs. One was the demographic methods, one was epidemiology, and the third is geography, the geographic methods. But we have yet to sort of build in. So if any young person today could master statistical analyses, either to address social sciences or to address health sciences, and understand the terminology and how they converge into explaining phenomena, because they do ultimately address the same natural phenomena. If they could also master the spatial sciences, they would be fine.
But now you have a new program in GIS and spatial sciences
At Hopkins.
At Hopkins.
Yes.
Are you associated with that, or do you?
I wish I was. I'm a little bit dense when it comes to the spatial analysis, other than know a few things about it. But yes, that's a great new certificate, applied diploma, I think it is, OPAL, applied program in something learning.
But I mean, I guess my question is really more: is there an attempt to wrap that into studies of population and family planning and other research going on there at Hopkins? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we have been, so I'm affiliated with the survey program that's new. It's family planning. It's on family planning performance. It's funded by the Gates Foundation. It's called Performance Monitoring and Accountability 2020. And they're using GIS methods to be able, right now one of the new things is how do you sample survey clusters without having to rely on census maps by drawing polygons, knowing what the underlying population is in those polygons, and then using that as a probability for selection. So that's one thing that they're integrating. Another is that obviously we do surveys where we obtain the GIS location, the geocoordinates of the household, and that because they repeatedly survey in the same area, sometimes the respondent ends up being selected in and had been interviewed earlier. So you can construct a cohort that way too, to see what, and that has obvious cost advantages. But also the other piece that I hope that I live long enough to do is to take them to see how the diffusion of fertility regulation or limitation ideas happens in the sub-Saharan African continent. You know, and how did families decide or learn that controlling their fertility was in their to their benefit?
I have one little follow-up question in terms of the future. I think that's a big one in terms of fertility in sub-Saharan Africa. But if I think about the 21st century globally anyway, in the context of population, it's a population environment issue. Particularly in the context of climate change and the migration that might happen, the mortality that might happen, et cetera. And as a director of a population center, can you imagine right now trying to get funding to examine in detail with good research the population-environment relationship?
I think it's possible. I think it has been done. I don't think that it has been done through the Gates Institute or at Hopkins. But definitely
even though we have an administration that's totally opposed to the notion that climate change is occurring.
True.
Would there be federal resources available for such research?
You know, there was, so again, optimism that if it doesn't come from the federal government right now, it might in a few years, or that there's another breakthrough source of funding for this. And one of the amazing things from where I sit that's happened to our society is the rise of all these people with wealth. What do they call them? High net worth individuals.
Oligarchs.
Oligarchs. High net worth individuals. The Bill and Melinda Gates, Michael Bloomberg, the person who is the head of all these very wealthy people who have actually started foundations and started to put their funding towards research. And so that's been immensely important. And you know, we can't be too grateful for their own humanitarian philanthropy in that regard.
Well, no, that takes us really back to the beginning of things in demography with Rockefeller and
Yes.
and Ford Foundation.
Yes,
getting
Rockefeller
things
and
started.
Ford.
Now, one kind of final question. 'Cause much of sorry, Karen, go ahead. Go ahead.
So you've worked with a number of donors, and Bill Gates has a particular reputation for correcting people's numbers, for being very numerate, and I'm sure Melinda is the same way. Is it different working with donors such as them who are also very quantitative compared to other donors that you've worked with?
It's different working with a funding organization where the person makes many of the decisions, as opposed to sort of a more corporate decision-making apparatus. So by the time I worked with Rockefeller, it was, long established as a foundation. But the Gates Foundation is still very much driven by the interests of the couple. And he is super brilliant, and so is she. And we are always keen to provide them any more information that they need, that they don't feel they have. But they have access to anybody. So if they come asking us for anything, we're more than happy.
The final question I was going to ask, is we're actually past our time, but it has to do with the role of culture, because it seems to me that the question that Dennis asked about, say, planetary health, and the work that you've done with respect to contraception, and we're talking about abortion, comes back to culture and how people view society, how they view the environment. And I'm wondering how you see that, even in your own work, as being part and parcel of the things that we need to focus on.
So I think planetary health is an outgrowth of our sort of interest in humanitarian and human well-being, humanitarian ethics and human well-being. I think it's hard to convince somebody who's struggling to survive in Uganda, a rural district in Uganda, that they should be stewards of the resources in their immediate environment. I don't think that they can't eventually become that way. But I think right now I feel like it's the privilege of those who are better off to be able to see the importance of conservation and protecting the environment. And I'm sure they will be, the other populations will be too. But probably it's our responsibility also to bear both the intellectual, the financial, and the technical costs of being sure that we protect planetary health. And I certainly hope we leave something for the next generation.
That's for sure. We only know of this one planet. Dennis, Karen, anything else
Want to say thanks?
No,
Thank you.
very, very
It's been
much
fun.
for
It's
sitting
been
down
great
with us
fun.
today. Very appreciate it very much.
Great fun.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.